Okay, welcome back to our live coverage of the United Nations Climate Talks here from Tianjin, China. I'm delighted to welcome John Watts, who is the Asia Environment Correspondent for The Guardian, the UK Guardian, and the author of When a Billion Chinese Jump. So hopefully we'll be able to get some insights into kind of media and climate change, and also to Chinese politics and climate change here. Perhaps we'll start with the media, because in the UK, media coverage of climate change is quite a big topic. It's a contentious issue, and you seem to see different parts of the media covering it in very different ways. What's the situation in China like?
I think there's two main differences with the coverage in the UK. The first one is, I think climate reporting is less mature here. Even 10 years ago, pollution, just local pollution, wasn't a huge issue. That's risen up the agenda, and it's only, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 years that climate has become a big issue that's covered more and more in the domestic media. So I've been to workshops even before Tianjin, organised by Greenpeace, where the idea is how do you cover a climate change meeting? How do you cover a climate conference? And all the Chinese journalists were there and asking questions, and I'm no expert either, but everybody's learning, and maybe China's coming a little bit behind everyone else. But there is a lot more interest than there was before, and there are a lot of media organisations sending people to big climate conferences. Copenhagen was a very big Chinese media team there. So that's one thing, it was sort of the maturity. The other thing I would say is, of course, the Chinese media environment, for political reasons, is very different. You don't have rollicking debates about issues that the government considers a priority, right, to the extent that you do in the UK. So the government has said, right, climate change is a fact, so you don't really see much climate skepticism coming through, and there isn't this sort of hammer and tongs argument, almost religious argument, do you believe, don't you believe, in China. You don't see that as much. Maybe come later, but not at the moment. So it's a bit more harmonised, for better or for worse. And one way in which that I heard that very clearly was at this conference of not conference, sort of seminar for Chinese journalists. And one of the Chinese journalists said, when we cover the climate conference, when I cover it anyway, is I think in my head I must be 70% with the government line, and 30% I can sort of explore the rights and wrongs of maybe that isn't exactly the way they're saying it is, and sort of pushing the boundaries. So very different from the way things are in the West, where newspapers take totally different lines and different commentators take totally different lines. There is variety, but perhaps not the same vitriol or extreme positions that you see in the UK.
Let me just ask you about your experience covering these talks then, and I know you're in Copenhagen as well. Do you think there's a big difference between the events and the fact that they've now come to China has been significant, or is it just another conference venue and you're still kind of struggling to make head or tail what's going on because there's so many kind of different strands to the negotiations?
Well, I think I hate covering conferences. It's boring. It's technical. It's hard. I always think I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I would say that this conference has been a bit easier than Copenhagen. It's not the same thing. They're both climate conferences, but of course Copenhagen expectations were so high, stress was so high, the number of people was enormous, and the pressure was really on. Here, it's lower key, it's not political level, it's a working level, it's a bit calmer. There's still tension, there's still pressure underneath, but it's a bit more civil. There's a bit more time to go up to people and talk to them. There's a sense that people are really here to get down to work. Don't know whether they'll achieve anything, but I found it a bit easier to cover. And then then there's also the China element. This is the first UN climate conference that China's ever hosted. The facilities are pretty impressive, very impressive. This venue's just opened in the last year or two, I think. And I think that has helped, the fact that it's kind of modern and nice and new, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is people seem to be more ready to roll up their sleeves and get down to work.
And you've been here for a few days now. We've been kind of like pushing through these negotiations. What's your sense of the progress that's being made? And it's difficult to interpret when so many of the meetings are taking place behind closed doors. But do you have an idea of what direction are we headed in?
Yeah, I think there has been progress. It's very hard to sort of quantify it, and there are clear areas where there are huge divisions still. But today I was speaking to people from small island states and speaking to G77 group, and their tone was pretty upbeat overall. That they felt there was movement on some of the issues that they're most concerned with, on finance, on technology transfer, on forests, perhaps a little bit uncertainty on forests, but and that they were more upbeat than I perhaps would have expected at the start of the week. But I wouldn't go too far. Everything could unravel very, very quickly, and on the much more important, the absolute core important issue of mitigation targets. Doesn't seem like there's been any movement at all there, and lots of bad blood over that issue. A lot of obstruction in the working groups, and very much that seems to be one of the areas where China and the US are sort of at loggerheads. So it looks like. It's still too early to tell, but it looks like Tianjin will take a bit of progress forward to Cancun, but whether that's enough to actually produce anything meaningful in Cancun, I think is still very, very far from sure.
I just want to ask you a little bit about the Chinese approach to these talks, because you're obviously living here and probably have a sense of the cultural and political factors that influence China's approach to the negotiations. Do you think, what are the significant elements and is there kind of a nationalism that informs kind of the approach to the environment more broadly and underpins this, or like what's motivating China's approach to these talks?
I think the primary motivation is to not have any restrictions on their development space. China sees itself as the leading developing nation. It wants to continue growing. It doesn't want any containment. The measures it wants to take to sort of deal with climate change tend to be measures that will benefit its own economy. They're certainly not alone in thinking that. Let's face it. But I think these sort of imperatives are driving them on. They want to be a responsible player, especially at an event like this. They want a bit of global credibility and status. They want to be seen as the nice guy. They were totally shocked at what happened in Copenhagen and the fact that so many people blame them for what happened. And I think they're trying to be a bit more the good guy here. I mean, they didn't think they were the bad guy there, but they realise they've got to actually get their message out more forcefully than they have done in the past. And they have selfish national interests, like every country has selfish national interests. But I think here they're trying to use this occasion to show, look, we are doing a lot. You're in Tianjin. We have a new high-speed rail network. We have a super efficient coal plant on the outside of here. We have an eco-city being built up the road, and we're about to unveil our new 5-year plan, which will contain fairly ambitious targets. The first ever targets for carbon intensity and for probably energy intensity, some other factors like that. So they're saying, look, we're doing a lot. Considering we're still a developing nation now. Whether they're doing enough, that's a key issue, of course, but it is an occasion for them to sort of get their message out.
And you said that they were shocked about being kind of the blame they received for Copenhagen. Why do you think that is? Is there kind of was it something lost in translation during the talks, or was it spun by the Western media in a way that they didn't feel it would be?
I think it's a combination of all those things. Partly, if you think, but for a long time, China really wasn't a big international diplomatic player, very self-contained. It's only as its economic interests become more interconnected with the outside world that it's really getting involved. So it's kind of, in one sense, it's learning as it goes along, as we all are. The climate's still relatively new. But that's particularly true, I think, in terms of the media and how they project themselves to the media. This is not a country that's used to having an open, challenging, combative, critical media. And so when they get, a bad press, one, that's a bit of a shock. And also I think the way they go into these sort of big public meetings, it's big conferences, the attitude towards public conferences is also different. If you look at what happened in Copenhagen, it really reminds me of the way China deals with its National People's Congress. That's the Chinese Parliament. It meets once a year. It's a very it's almost a ceremonial occasion. Yes, it's supposed to be when the legislators decide everything. Yes, there's a debate, but pretty much the most important decisions are made in advance, largely rubber stamped in the NPC. And I think to a degree that's how they saw Copenhagen. They did a lot in advance. China announced its first ever carbon target, and it has these pretty ambitious goals on renewable energy and so forth. And I think they thought, right, that's our plan, is we're going to go to Copenhagen, we're going to say, look, we're doing all this. We're still a developing nation. We've come this far. Give us credit for that. That was their plan A, not a bad plan A. They had done a lot. But Copenhagen wasn't a ceremonial occasion. It was fluid. It was where there was supposed to be a big debate. I think when few things started to move, Hillary Clinton comes in and says, we will commit to the 2020 $100 billion of climate funds per year. It's like, the US has moved. Now who else is going to move? And everyone looks to China. Where's China's movement? It's very hard to see. So I think they didn't really have a plan B. They didn't have the opportunity to show movement. And also, I think they really dropped the ball in terms of public relations on the last 2 days, because for most of Copenhagen conference, they were giving press meetings every day. But the last 2 days, the most important 2 days, that stopped. And they left without saying a word. And while every other country was briefing away, giving their side of the argument, you didn't hear anything apart from a very short statement from China that was issued a day later or something like that. And their real view of what happened was even later than that. And so I think they were kind of slow, and it's like playing a good game of football for 89 minutes and then just leaving your goal unguarded for the last part. That doesn't mean the accusations against them were not true. They may be, and some of them probably are, but it just means they didn't actually put their side of the case until it was almost too late. So in that sense, I think the public relations, the media engagement side of things was a shock. And they, about 2 months after Copenhagen, there was a workshop of academics, NGOs, media people, officials on what went wrong and how can we learn from that.
That's interesting stuff.